Hello, I'm Todd Phillips, the editor of Canadian Auto Dealer. We're here today with Michael Dunne. He's the CEO of Dunne Insights. He's the host of the popular Driving with Dunne podcast, an author, an entrepreneur, and he's one of the sharpest minds that's covering the global EV market. And he regularly interviews the top leaders from a lot of these companies and experts in the space. So, Michael, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Todd. Looking forward to this conversation.
And we're here today really to talk about your appearance at the CADA Summit. You're going to be one of the keynote speakers in February at the summit, and very interested in hearing your perspective and all of that. But to help our audience sort of get a sense of the lens or the filter, if you will, that you're going to bring your analysis to, give us a bit of your background, if you would.
A few highlights. First and foremost, I'm a native of Detroit, grew up around cars. My dad is the legendary spy photographer called Jim Dunne. He'd be the guy that would take me out to Milford Proving Grounds at GM and try to capture next generation vehicles. So by the time I was 16, 17 years old, I'd been around cars a lot. And then I asked him for advice. Where should I take things? And he said, go far, go out and invent something new. So I took him literally, and right out of school, 1990, flew to China with the ambition of doing a startup. What kind of startup? I didn't know exactly, but I had a hunch that US and Western automakers would want to get into the China market. When they got there, they like to have a guy from Detroit be able to show them around. That was my first company, which later on merged with JD Power. I ran JD Power's operations in China, Southeast Asia for several years. Then I did a startup in Indonesia, ran General Motors Indonesia for a while. And then about 5 years ago, came back to the United States, attracted by the prospect of electric vehicles. Now, I had seen its growth in China, and I felt like with Tesla, it was only a matter of time before we're going to start to see electrics right here in North America. I'm based in California, working actively to advise investors, automakers, and suppliers on future trends in electric vehicles. And when it comes to that, China is front and center. That's why we're having this conversation today.
Well, it's a perfect segue. Tease it up perfectly. In fact, the focus of your presentation at the summit is really about China and EVs and sort of the broader market, outlook in terms of ICE. Well, let's start with China. It's hard today it's hard not to talk about China when you're talking about EVs. I mean, it's really at the center of it. I guess China is really poised and already surpassed Japan as sort of the largest exporter of cars. A lot of people might not be aware of that. But what's really the growth strategy for North America? And we're seeing sort of the exports already starting in Europe. But what can we expect to see down the road? I think we were chatting earlier just before we started, and you're saying Americans could be kind of oblivious and Canadians because we're not seeing a lot of these on our soil yet. But tell us a bit about what's coming.
That's exactly right. I call it, the modern automotive Godzilla, the likes of which we've never seen before. China today has the capacity to build 50 million cars a year, more than half of global demand. And what's happening at home is the Chinese economy is slowed, demand is slowed, profits have evaporated. So the Chinese automakers have pivoted in a big way to start exporting. And as you said, they're now the number one exporter of vehicles globally, surpassing Japan this year. And they're essentially in more than 100 markets worldwide. The only two remaining markets that we don't see Chinese cars are, guess what? Canada and the United States. But don't worry, the Chinese are getting ready. They're preparing as we speak to capture these very important markets. And that means new opportunities for dealers in North America.
Well, one of the things about the North American market, it's also one of the markets, I'm hoping you can comment on this as well, that it's not exactly been warmly embracing EVs. I would say it's a reluctant embrace in both Canada and the US. There's government incentives and mandates that are really trying to drive consumer demand. The OEMs are certainly meeting that demand with new products, but it's a different climate. There's a different history here in terms of some of the barriers, the charging infrastructure, some of the underpinning of what's required isn't really in place enough to give people enough confidence. But all of that being said, that's not the reality in many other parts of the world where there's less resistance to EVs. Perhaps that's why the Chinese EVs makers aren't here yet. I'm not sure exactly. Well, I'd like to get your thoughts on that. But what do you see out there in the rest of the world in terms of the adoption, if you will, less resistance towards the coming of this new technology?
China's a runaway leader here. They'll produce and buy more than 8 million EVs, more than the rest of the world combined. So if you think about where production is centered and where demand is centered, it's China. Next is Europe. If it's a horse race, several lengths behind. If China's at 8 million this year, Europe will roll in at about 2.5 million, and the US about 1 million. If you add in Canada, 1 million plus. So we're really several lengths behind. I think the key difference is that we're so entrenched in lifestyles of big vehicles traveling at high speeds on highways, long distances. And this is sort of the opposite of what an electric vehicle is meant to serve. They're much better suited in smaller commutes, smaller vehicles, city commuting, like we have in China and Europe. So it's definitely going to take a mindset change in North America for us to really embrace electrics beyond early adopters.
And I think that, there's some thinking that the early adopters have already kind of embraced them and maybe sort of filled their boots, if you will, with EVs. But the next generation of adoption is going to take more work. Is that what you've seen elsewhere in the world, or is there, because of these factors that you mentioned, geography and driving habits, it was just an easier road in some of these other places around the world?
Those are all factors. Add to that the importance of price. Here in North America, an EV still costs upwards $50,000 to $55,000 on average. And in China, you can get cars for half that price and lower. So the Chinese are readying, saying, look, the North American automakers have basically vacated cars. They're not doing cars for the most part anymore. They vacated the lower price points. Oh boy, wait till we get our own versions of the Hyundai into those markets. Right now, they're having spectacular success in Mexico quietly. China is the number one supplier of cars to Mexico. Next will be Canada, because your import duties are much lower than here in the United States. And last will be the United States, where we're super vigilant about letting the Chinese come in. So it's really a matter of, I think, price has a big part. Price is a big deal, as is charging infrastructure and driving styles, lifestyles. But the Chinese are setting up to be the answer to people's question, when will we have electric, affordable vehicles?
Well, one thing you hit on very interesting right at the outset was you mentioned that this new coming wave of electric vehicles from China, from elsewhere, will create new opportunities for dealers. Obviously, there's a different model in many of these companies, sort of more of a direct consumer model with some of the pure EV startups. What do you see for dealers? Maybe you've seen this in other parts of the world, in Europe or otherwise, for their opportunities. Maybe not with their existing franchises, but their business people always on the lookout for opportunity.
Absolutely. European dealers are delighted, especially in the UK, where the MG brand is doing really well. That was originally a British brand acquired by SAIC about 15 years ago. They'll sell more than 150,000 MGs in Europe this year. So dealers are super happy with the relationship, and SAIC is going with the conventional, traditional franchise dealer setup. When it comes to Canada, if I'm a Canadian dealer today, I'd look at 3 brands. Number one, of course, the big dog is BYD. They'll build about 3 million electrics this year. Next would be SAIC with the MG brand. And third would be Geely with its Volvo, Polestar, and Zeekr brands. Those are the 3 to watch. And I think that they'll be quite open to the dealer relationship, not going direct, at least for those brands. Other ones like NIO and XPeng hope to go direct. But these big guys, up until now, seem content to go with the dealer model.
Well, that'll be good news. We're stealing a bit of your thunder from the summit there, but they'll be very curious. There'll be people jotting down notes when you mention some of those brands. So I appreciate that perspective. Just have really one more question here. My friends at CADA don't like us to go too in depth because we want everyone to show up February 14th and hear you in person. But in terms of the production side, a lot of OEMs have announced a lot of plans for EV production globally, and maybe not as much investment happening yet. Do you think that it's going to happen? And do you think what can really happen? It seems that they're still fighting the legacy production costs, whether it's negotiating labor unions and agreements and such, versus sort of the real both all in on the EVs. Where do you see sort of that production map happening? Is it kind of messy at the moment as the legacy brands, if you will, are now looking to try to compete on that scale with the new entrants?
I see the Inflation Reduction Act as sort of a response to the Sputnik 2 moment, where the United States and Canada realize, oh my goodness, we are years behind the industry leader, the technology leader, that being China. What are we going to do about it? And if you look at actual investments since 2021, there's more than $100 billion that have been invested in battery plants. They call it the battery belt throughout much of the Southeast United States, Midwest, some out here in the West, California, Arizona, and also Quebec is also getting a lot of attention, especially with regards to minerals and mining. So we're just in the early stages of those investments. Much depends, of course, on the political winds. Where does the U.S. want to take things in the next election? This is the biggest risk on the horizon. Are we committed to following through on this $100 billion, or is it going to be, oh, you know what, we changed our mind, too hard, we're not going to do it? That's still to be decided.
Well, maybe we'll leave it there. We've got two really capable analysts, David Frum and Andrew Coyne, who's a columnist in the Globe and Mail here, are going to look at the economic and political landscape in the years ahead. It's going to be an interesting year, election season, silly season. Sometimes it's going to be very interesting. There's a lot riding on at the automotive industry. We're watching very carefully in terms of the outcomes of that. But listen, it was great meeting you here today, and I look forward to meeting you and interviewing in person at the event itself. But I know the dealers will be paying close attention to your observations. So appreciate the time today.
Tremendous. I do hear from the Chinese automakers that Canada is a top priority right now. So the timing could not be better for this event.
Awesome. Well, we'll see you in February, and we're going to hear all these observations in person. Thanks a lot, Michael. Appreciate it.
Thank you.